On the last Saturday of August in 1974, at the Madison County Fair in northeastern Nebraska, a 17-year-old girl named Cassie Hartwell walked up to the microphone at the youth talent competition and did something that nobody in that tent would forget for the rest of their lives. She stood there in a yellow cotton dress that her mother had ironed the night before, her brown hair pulled back with a clip, her hands gripping the sides of the podium so hard that her knuckles went white. She had practiced this moment in her bedroom for 3 weeks. She had practiced it in the barn while her father was out in the fields. She had practiced it in front of the bathroom mirror until the glass fogged up from her breath. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. She had the words ready. They were right there, lined up perfectly in her mind, waiting. And then she opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not a sound, not a syllable. Just silence and the low hum of a crowd that was still settling down from the act before her. A 12-year-old boy who had played a passable version of a John Denver song on a battered acoustic guitar. People were still talking to each other, still rustling in their folding chairs, still thinking about the lemonade stand outside and whether the humidity was going to break before evening. Then someone noticed the girl at the microphone. The silence spread from the front of the tent to the back the way silence always does when something strange is happening and people aren't sure yet whether to pay attention. One by one, faces turned toward the stage. Cassie Hartwell stood there in her yellow dress, and she still hadn't said a word, and now 300 people were looking at her. A woman in the third row whispered something to her husband. A child near the back asked his mother what was happening, and Cassie Hartwell opened her mouth again. What came out was not a sentence. It was not even a word. It was the sound of a word trying to be born and getting stuck somewhere between her chest and her lips, a kind of caught breath. A silent collision of intention and failure. Her face went the color of a summer tomato. Her eyes stayed fixed on some point above the crowd, above the tent, somewhere out in the flat Nebraska sky where nobody could see her. This was the stutter. This was the thing that had followed Cassie Hartwell since she was 4 years old, that had sat beside her at every school desk, that had turned every classroom reading assignment into a quiet form of torture, that had taught her to nod instead of speak and point, instead of ask, and keep the best parts of herself locked somewhere deep inside where no one could reach them. The stutter was not a stranger. It was practically family, the unwanted kind. She closed her eyes. She breathed. And then she spoke. "My name is Cassie Hartwell," she said, "and I want to be a professional auctioneer." The tent went quiet for one full second. That 1 second felt to Cassie Hartwell like it lasted approximately the rest of her natural life. Then the laughter started. It began with a few people near the middle of the crowd, genuine surprised laughter, the kind that erupts out of you before you can stop it, before you have the chance to wonder whether laughing is the decent thing to do. It spread quickly because laughter always does, because a crowd is its own organism, and it moves in waves, and within a few seconds, the whole tent was filled with it. A rolling tide of amusement that washed up against the canvas walls and came back again. An auctioneer, a girl who could barely get through her own name, wanted to become an auctioneer. In 1974 in Madison County, Nebraska, the idea of a woman working as a professional livestock and estate auctioneer was not merely unusual. It was something that people in that part of the country had simply never seen, not once, not ever. The auction yards were men's territory, built by men, run by men, attended by men, in seed caps and worn boots, who conducted their business with handshakes and studied silences and the particular unspoken language of people who have spent their whole lives reading weather and soil and market prices. A woman might attend an auction. A woman might help keep the books afterward, but stand behind that podium, hold that microphone, command that crowd. The idea had never occurred to most of the people in that tent, and this particular woman wanted to do it while also fighting a stutter. The laughter kept going. It was not cruel, not exactly, though it had edges that could cut if you let them. It was more like the laughter of 300 people simultaneously confronted with something they had never considered before, and finding it in the moment genuinely funny. The absurdity of it, the sheer audacity. Cassie Hartwell stood at that microphone and let the laughter happen to her. She did not run. She did not cry. She stared at that point above the crowd and waited the way you wait for a storm to pass when there's nowhere to go. And then a voice cut through everything. Walter Greer was not a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. At 6'3" and well over 200 pounds, with 2,200 acres of prime Nebraska farmland to his name and his family's bank holding notes on half the county, Walter Greer had the kind of authority that made rooms go quiet without effort. He was sitting in the front row as he always did at community events, because the front row was where important people sat, and Walter Greer had spent 60 years being an important person. He wore a clean white shirt despite the heat. His boots were good leather. Everything about him communicated permanence, weight, the settled confidence of a man who has never had a single morning in his life when he woke up uncertain about his own worth. He turned in his chair and looked at Cassie with something that might have been amusement and might have been pity, and was almost certainly a mixture of both. "Honey," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the tent, "we already have enough trouble finding men who can do this job." The laughter got louder. Walter's friends and Walter had a great many friends, the kind that prosperity and power collect naturally over decades, joined in with particular enthusiasm. Someone behind Cassie made a sound that she would remember for the rest of her life without being able to describe exactly what it was, something between a laugh and a dismissal, the sound of a door being closed. Eldon Hartwell was sitting in the third row. He was a quiet man by nature, a farmer who worked 160 acres on the eastern edge of the county and supplemented things with part-time work at the grain cooperative in town, a man who measured his words the way he measured his seed corn, carefully, never more than was needed. He had not laughed. From the moment his daughter opened her mouth, Eldon Hartwell had been sitting very still in his folding chair with his hands resting on his knees and his jaw set in a particular way that his wife Willa knew meant he was feeling something large that he had no intention of showing to anyone. Cassie heard the laughter. She felt it against her skin like weather. Every part of her that was 17 years old and already acquainted with humiliation told her to step away from the microphone, to walk back into the crowd, to pretend this had been someone else's idea, to start practicing the various ways she would explain this moment to herself in the years ahead, so that it hurt less than it actually did. She did not step away. She tightened her hands on the podium, and she looked directly at Walter Greer, and she waited until the laughter began to thin, and she leaned into the microphone, and she said, her voice clear and steady, in a way that surprised everyone in the tent, and perhaps herself most of all, "Someday, Mr. Greer, someday I am going to sell something of yours." The tent went completely silent. Walter Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled slowly, the smile of a man who finds a situation more entertaining than threatening. He turned back to his friends and said something that Cassie couldn't hear over the fresh wave of laughter that followed. But Eldon Hartwell in the third row allowed himself one small private smile that nobody saw except Willa, who was sitting beside him and who reached over and put her hand on his arm without saying anything at all. Cassie Hartwell walked off that stage to scattered applause. The talent competition moved on to a girl who could do a respectable imitation of a fiddle tune on a borrowed instrument. But the moment stayed. It stayed in the tent, and it stayed in the county, and it stayed, most importantly, in Cassie herself, lodged somewhere below her ribs, where the important things always lodge. Now let me tell you who Cassie Hartwell actually was, because a moment like that one only makes sense if you understand what was behind it. Cassie was born in 1957 in Norfolk, Nebraska, the only child of Eldon and Willa Hartwell. Eldon farmed and worked the cooperative. Willa kept the books at the county courthouse in a small office that smelled like paper and floor wax and the particular dusty patience of civic institutions. They were not wealthy people. They were not poor people either, not in the way that grinds a family down to nothing. They were the in-between kind, the kind that has enough if nothing goes badly wrong, the kind where every large decision requires sitting at the kitchen table after supper and going through the numbers twice. The stutter arrived when Cassie was 4 years old, without warning and without explanation. One morning she could speak normally. Within a few weeks the words were catching, jamming, piling up behind something invisible in her throat, like cars in a fog bank collision. The doctors said what doctors said in those days, that it sometimes just happened, that many children grew out of it, that patience was the appropriate response. Cassie did not grow out of it. School was its own particular kind of difficulty. Not because the teachers were unkind, though some were, but because the machinery of school assumes that speaking is easy, that answering when your name is called is a simple matter of knowing the answer and opening your mouth. For Cassie, every time a teacher looked in her direction, a small disaster began assembling itself behind her sternum. The words would be there clear and correct, and then the moment of actually producing them would arrive, and everything would seize up like an engine without oil. The other children noticed because children always notice the thing that makes someone different. Some of them were decent about it. Many were not. Cassie learned the geometry of a school hallway, which routes could be taken between classes with the least chance of encountering the particular cluster of boys near the gym lockers who had discovered that asking her questions and then imitating her attempts to answer was entertaining in a way that never seemed to get old for them. She learned to arrive at class early and sit in the back and keep her eyes on her notes and make herself as unnoticeable as possible, a girl shaped like a presence who had learned to occupy space like an absence. What she did not learn to do was stop wanting. The wanting was always there. It was quieter than the stutter, less visible, but it had been there since she was very small and it was not something she could explain to anyone, which meant it lived entirely inside her, unexpressed and therefore intact. What she wanted specifically was to be an auctioneer. Her father had started bringing her to the livestock auctions in the county when she was 6 years old. They would sit in the wooden bleachers that smelled like sawdust and animal heat, and she would watch the auctioneers the way other children watch magic shows with that particular intensity of attention that happens when you see something that doesn't seem like it should be possible. The chant was what got her, the rhythmic, rolling, hypnotic flood of syllables that auctioneers produce, that particular music that is not quite music and not quite speech, but something in between, something that seems to bypass ordinary language entirely and go straight to some older part of the brain. She would listen to it, and something in her chest would open up, some tension she carried constantly would ease, and she would feel, without being able to articulate why, like she was listening to something that was meant specifically for her. She began trying to replicate it when she was 13. She would go out to the barn in the evenings after her chores were done, when the light was going gold and the swallows were making their last passes over the fields, and she would stand in the middle of the barn floor and she would try. Quietly at first, barely above a whisper, and then louder as she got more confident and realized that her father was far enough away in the fields not to hear. She had a style she had assembled from memory, a composite of every auctioneer she had ever watched, and she practiced it the way a musician practices scales, not thinking about performance, just running the pattern until it became automatic. And she discovered something. When she fell into the rhythm of the chant, when she stopped trying to speak in the normal way and started trying to chant instead, the stutter went away. Not always, not completely, but enough. The words flowed out of her in a continuous stream, the rhythm carrying them forwards the way a current carries, leaves no jamming, no blocking, no humiliating silence where a word should be. She did not tell anyone about this for 4 years. It was too fragile, too strange, too easy to lose. She kept it in the barn and in her bedroom, and inside herself this small, extraordinary private miracle. This discovery that the things she couldn't do in any ordinary context, she could do perfectly in this one specific way. She kept practicing. She got better. By the time she was 17, she could chant for 20 minutes without stopping, and she had started to understand, in a way that went beyond just mechanical repetition, what the rhythms were doing and how to use them to build and release and sustain attention. She had never performed it in front of anyone until the Madison County Fair. 3 days after the talent competition, Cassie sat in her room and did not speak to anyone. Not from anger, though there was some anger, more from a kind of interior stillness that came over her when something important was being decided in a part of herself that was below the reach of ordinary thought. She sat on her bed and looked at the wall and let the decision make itself. On the fourth day, there was a knock on her door. Eldon Hartwell came in and sat on the edge of her desk chair the way he always sat when he had something to say, with his forearms resting on his knees and his eyes on the floor for a moment before he looked up. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense, but he had the kind of face that weather and work and genuine decency build over decades, the kind of face that is worth looking at because every line in it is true. He said, "Do you still want it?" Not a question quite, more like an acknowledgement that the answer already existed and he was just giving her permission to say it out loud. Cassie looked at her father for a long moment. "Everyone thinks it's ridiculous," she said. I didn't ask what everyone thinks. Yes, she said. I still want it. Eldon nodded once. Then we find you a school. He reached into his shirt pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the desk between them. Missouri Auction School, Kansas City. 3 weeks. Cassie looked at the paper and then back at her father. She knew what 3 weeks in Kansas City cost. She knew what $400 meant to a family like theirs, knew it with the particular clarity of a child who has spent her whole life understanding without being told directly exactly where the edges of things are. They won't take a girl, she said, not for the real certification, not for livestock and estate. Eldon stood up. He picked up the piece of paper and held it out to her. Then you'll be the first, he said. He left the room. Cassie sat with the paper in her hands. 2 weeks later, Eldon drove her to the bus station in Norfolk. It was early morning, the sky still mostly dark, the air already carrying the particular weight that August air carries in Nebraska, thick and patient and smelling of turned earth. They stood by the bus with her single bag, and neither of them said much because they were both that kind of people. When the driver announced final boarding, Eldon put his hand briefly on her shoulder. You stand there until they listen, he said. That's all. Just stand there. She got on the bus. She was 17 years old and she had $400 of her family's money in her pocket, and she was more frightened than she had been in her entire life, and she did not look out the window as the bus pulled away because she was afraid that if she saw her father standing there in the half-dark, she would lose whatever it was she had decided in her room during those 3 silent days. She looked straight ahead instead, all the way to Kansas City. The Missouri Auction School was housed in a converted warehouse near the old Stockyards district, a part of the city that smelled like the remnant memory of cattle and commerce, like the ghost of 100 years of business conducted at high volume. The building itself was large and not particularly comfortable, with concrete floors and metal ceiling fans that moved the air around without exactly cooling it, and rows of folding chairs facing a practice podium at the front. There were 30 students in the session. Cassie counted them on the first morning. 30 students ranging in age from about 18 to somewhere in their mid-50s, farmers' sons and hardware store owners, and a few men who had some previous auction experience and were looking to formalize it. Cassie Hartwell was the only woman in the room. She had known this was likely. She had prepared herself for it on the bus ride. She was still not entirely prepared for the way it felt in practice, that specific texture of being the single anomaly in a room full of people who belong naturally to each other by some quality you don't share. The men did not treat her badly, most of them. They just treated her the way you treat something you are not sure what to make of, with a certain careful blankness, a politeness that hasn't decided yet whether it contains respect. The instructor's name was Clem Burgess. He was 62 years old and had been calling auctions since the Eisenhower administration, and he had a voice that seemed physically larger than his body, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest and filled whatever room it entered without apparent effort. He had seen by his own accounting every variety of student that existed, the quick learners and the slow ones, the naturals and the hopeless cases, the ones who thought they knew everything and the ones who were so frightened they could barely stand at the podium. On the first morning, he looked at Cassie Hartwell for a long moment. Then he said, not unkindly, I want to tell you something before we start. She waited. I have run this school for 19 years, he said. I have graduated 231 students. Not one of them has been a woman. He paused. I am not telling you that to discourage you. I am telling you so you understand that I don't know what to expect, and I prefer to be honest about that. She appreciated the honesty. She told him so. He nodded once and moved on to the first lesson. The first day, every student had to stand at the practice podium and demonstrate their current level of ability, whatever they could produce, without instruction, their raw material. This was Clem Burgess's standard opening his way of seeing what he was working with. Students went in order, left to right across the room. When Cassie's turn came, she walked to the podium on legs that did not feel entirely reliable. She looked out at the room. 29 men looked back at her. Clem Burgess said, go ahead. She opened her mouth. The wall came up. That old familiar wall, the invisible collision point between intention and production, the place where words turned to silence. Standing in front of 29 men who were already uncertain about her, the wall was higher than it had ever been. She could feel the seconds accumulating. She could see in the faces of the men nearest her the beginning of something, a shared glance, a slight shift in posture, the early signals of an assessment being made. Someone coughed. Someone else moved in their chair. Cassie closed her eyes. She went back to the barn. She went back to those evenings in the last summer light with the swallows outside and the smell of hay and the feeling of the rhythm finding her of the words lining up differently in the chant, not conversation, but music, not speech, but something older. She stopped trying to talk. She started trying to chant. What came out of her was not perfect. It was not fast, but it was fluid. The words came in a continuous stream, the rhythm carrying them forward one into the next. No wall, no silence, no humiliation. She chanted for about 90 seconds, and then she stopped, and she opened her eyes, and she looked at Clem Burgess. The room was completely silent. Clem Burgess walked slowly from the side wall where he had been standing to the podium where Cassie was standing. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face for a long moment the way he might look at a piece of machinery he was trying to understand. How long, he said. The stutter. My life, she said. Back to normal speech now, the wall back in place, the words catching again. But not when you chant, he said. No, sir. Not usually. He was quiet. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and looked at the room. Pay attention, he said to the 29 men watching from their chairs. All of you, this young woman is going to show you something. He turned back to Cassie. What you just did, he said, his voice lower now, not for the room, but for her, that is not something I have seen before. In 19 years of teaching, he paused. Your brain found its way around something that stops most people cold. Do you understand what that means? She said she thought so. It means you worked harder than any of these men. Before you walked in this door, he said. It means you already know the most important thing there is to know about this craft, which is that the rhythm is not decoration. The rhythm is the thing itself, and you found that out alone. He stepped back. He addressed the room again. Let's begin, he said. Cassie Hartwell was the worst student in the class for the first week. Not significantly, not in a way that confirmed anyone's doubts, but measurably in the specific technical areas where she had less raw speed than men who had been talking loudly in front of crowds since boyhood, at livestock shows and church socials, and the particular training ground of male American rural life that teaches a certain easy command of public space. She worked harder than anyone in the class. She was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave in the afternoon. She practiced in her small rented room in a boarding house 3 blocks from the warehouse until her voice was raw and the woman in the next room knocked on the wall. By the second week, she was middle of the class. By the third week, when graduation came, she was not the best student in the room. But she was not the worst either, and she was improving faster than anyone, including Clem Burgess, had thought possible. She had a gift for reading the room that the instructor mentioned specifically in his graduation remarks, a quality of attention of watching the people in front of her while she was performing that most students took years to develop if they developed it at all. She received her certificate on a Friday afternoon in late September, shaking Clem Burgess's hand in front of the other students and their families. He held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and he said quietly so that only she could hear, "What you're going to face when you get home, it's not going to be fair." He looked at her steadily. "Do it anyway, don't stop. And when you're the best one in the room, make sure they know it." She went home to Norfolk, Nebraska with her certificate in her bag and the rhythm in her bones. She was 17 years old. She was officially a licensed auctioneer. She was a woman in a profession that had never had one. She was going back to the county where Walter Greer had laughed at her in front of 300 people. She was ready, or at least she believed she was ready, which is perhaps the most important thing, because there was no way to be actually ready for what was coming. There never is. You just have to believe in yourself hard enough to start moving and trust that the belief will carry you through long enough to become something more solid. Eldon Hartwell picked her up at the bus station in the same pre-dawn quiet they had said goodbye in, and he drove her home on roads she had known her entire life, past fields she could name by owner from memory, under the enormous flat Nebraska sky that was going from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a morning that has decided to be beautiful. He did not ask her how it went. He did not say, "I told you so," though he had been right. He drove and she sat beside him, and they were quiet together in the way of people who understand each other well enough that silence is not empty. When they pulled into the driveway and he turned off the engine, he sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. "What's next?" he said. She told him. He nodded. Good, he said. They went inside and Willa had coffee ready, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, and for a little while everything was very simple and very good, the way things sometimes are right before they get complicated, because the world had not changed while Cassie was in Kansas City. Madison County was exactly as she had left it. The auction yards and the cooperatives and the banks and the informal networks of men who did business with each other over handshakes and shared history, all of it was exactly as it had always been. And somewhere in a large house at the center of that world, Walter Greer was watching and waiting and remembering a 17-year-old girl in a yellow dress who had looked him in the eye and said something he had not expected. He had laughed then. He was not laughing now. The first thing Cassie Hartwell did when she got home from Kansas City was call Cal Renner. Cal owned the main auction house in Norfolk, a low-slung building on the south side of town with a gravel parking lot that flooded every spring and a sign out front that had been faded to near illegibility by 15 Nebraska summers. He was not a wealthy man, not by Walter Greer's standards, but he ran a respectable operation that handled estate sales and farm equipment and the occasional livestock consignment, and he was known in the county as a man who was fair in his dealings and honest in his accounting, which counted for more in that part of the world than most people outside of it understood. Cal had listened to Cassie on the phone. He had been cautious, but not unkind. He had said he would think about it. 2 days later, he called back and said she could have a shot at the Delphine Rourke estate sale, a modest job household goods, and some outbuildings equipment belonging to an elderly widow who had recently moved to a care facility in Omaha. Nothing glamorous, but real work, real pay, a real chance. She started preparing immediately. She walked the Rourke property twice, cataloging every item, estimating values, building the sequence of lots in her head and the way Earl Maddox would later teach her to do, more formally thinking about how to pace the day, where to build momentum, which lots would generate excitement and which would drag if she wasn't careful. She practiced her chant every evening until midnight. She felt for the first time in her life like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The call from Cal came 2 days before the sale. His voice on the phone was quiet and something else, a quality underneath the quiet that she recognized without wanting to name it. He said, "Cassie, I'm sorry, I can't use you for the Rourke sale. I have to pull the offer." She asked why. There was a pause that lasted long enough to tell her everything she needed to know before he said a single additional word. "Walter Greer came by my office yesterday afternoon," Cal said. "He sat down in that chair across from my desk, and he was perfectly friendly about it, perfectly pleasant the way he always is when he's telling you exactly how things are going to go. He told me that if I let a girl run one of my auctions, he would take his business elsewhere. His estate sales, his equipment, consignments, his referrals to the other large landowners in the county. He said the same would go for anyone he heard was working with you." Cassie did not say anything. Cal's voice got softer. "I want you to know this is not my choice," he said. "You came in here with your certificate and you were professional and prepared, and I had no reason not to give you the work. But Walter Greer does a great deal of business in this county. He has done business with me for 20 years. I have a family, Cassie. I have a mortgage on that building. I cannot afford to cross him." She thanked Cal for telling her the truth. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time alone in the house because her parents were both at work, and she looked at the surface of the table and thought very carefully about what had just happened and what it meant. She had expected resistance. She had understood even before the talent show that what she was attempting was not something that would be accepted easily or quickly. She had prepared herself for the ordinary friction of being first, the sideways looks and the careful politeness and the extra scrutiny that comes with being the person who doesn't fit the existing pattern. She had not quite anticipated Walter Greer. What Walter was doing was not the ordinary friction of bias. It was deliberate, organized, and specific. He was not simply a man who doubted her. He was a man who had decided to invest time and social capital in making sure she failed, and he had enough of both to make that investment meaningful. He had money, and money in a county like Madison meant leverage, meant favors owed, meant the ability to make things happen or prevent them from happening in ways that ordinary people couldn't easily resist. And he was not done. Over the next 3 months, Cassie would learn the full shape of what Walter Greer had put in motion. It was not just Cal Renner. It was 3 other auction houses within driving distance. It was the agricultural lenders who finance farmers' equipment purchases and who had heard from Walter that a woman auctioneer at your sale would undermine buyer confidence and hurt your final numbers. It was the informal network of large landowners who gathered for coffee on Tuesday mornings at the diner on Main Street in Norfolk, men who shaped opinion in the county the way weather shapes landscapes slowly and completely and without appearing to try. Walter had reached all of them. The message was delivered in different ways to different people, but it was always the same message underneath. A woman cannot do this job, and anyone who lets her try will be embarrassed by the results, and the embarrassment will be on you. He was not using cruelty. That was the thing that took Cassie longest to fully understand. Walter Greer was not a man who needed to be vicious. He was simply explaining in his reasonable and authoritative way how things worked, and he was doing it from within a system that had always agreed with him, that had been built around his kind of certainty, and had never had any particular reason to question it. He was not fighting a woman. He was maintaining a world. And Cassie Hartwell was going to have to find a way through it. She heard about Earl Maddox in October from her father. Eldon had worked a co-op shift alongside a man who had once used Maddox auction for a farm sale, who still talked about it the way people talk about a performance they witnessed once that they've never quite stopped measuring other things against. Earl Maddox, the man said, was the best there had ever been in this part of the state, retired now after his stroke, living alone on the edge of town. Cassie drove to his house on a Wednesday morning and knocked on the door. The man who answered was not physically imposing in the way she had expected from the stories. He was in his early 70s, his right side carrying the permanent evidence of the stroke, in the way he held himself, a slight lean, a careful economy of movement on that side, as though he had made a long peace with a limitation and was no longer interested in drawing attention to it. His face was sharp, watchful, the face of someone who has spent 50 years reading people in crowds and has not lost the habit. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I know who you are," he said. "Come in." For the next hour, Cassie stood at the far end of his living room and demonstrated everything she had learned in Kansas City and everything she had taught herself in the barn before that. Earl sat in his armchair with his eyes mostly closed and his head tilted slightly, listening the way a musician listens, not for the words but for the structure underneath them. He stopped her occasionally. Again, he'd say, "Or where is that coming from?" Or slower, and find it again. When she finished, the room was quiet. Earl was silent for long enough that she began to wonder if she had done something wrong, missed something obvious, produced something worse than she thought. Then he said, "Your stutter is not your biggest problem here, and you know it." She said she knew. He looked at her directly for the first time since she had started. "You walked into every room in this county before you opened your mouth, and you were already starting 20 yards behind the line." He said it plainly, not with sympathy exactly, but with the particular respect of someone who is willing to tell you the true shape of a difficult thing. That's the reality of it. Walter Greer hasn't created that reality. He's just using it. There's a difference. She asked what the difference meant practically. Earl leaned forward in his chair. "It means you can't beat Walter Greer by arguing with him. You can't win that argument. He's got too much weight behind him, and the weight has been there too long." He shifted slightly, the careful adjustment of a man managing discomfort. "But you can make what he's saying irrelevant. You do that by being so clearly and undeniably the best option available that the people who need your services can't afford to listen to him anymore." He paused. "That takes time. And it takes someone willing to work harder than anyone around them for longer than feels reasonable." He looked at her steadily. "Are you that person?" he said. She told him she intended to be. He nodded once. "Then come back Thursday. Bring your lunch. We'll start properly." What followed were 3 years that Cassie Hartwell would spend the rest of her life being grateful for, though they did not feel like something to be grateful for while they were happening. They felt like a gauntlet, like a daily process of being tested in ways that were sometimes technical and sometimes physical, and sometimes simply a matter of refusing to stop when stopping would have been understandable. Earl Maddox was not a gentle teacher. He had been at the top of his craft for nearly 50 years, and he had very clear ideas about what that craft required and very little patience for anything that fell short of those requirements. He pushed Cassie on her speed, on her crowd reading, on her sequencing, on the physical endurance that a full-day auction demands from a body that is standing and projecting for 6 or 8 hours without meaningful rest. He pushed her on the psychology of it, on understanding what a room of buyers was doing emotionally at any given moment, where the excitement was building, and where it was flagging how to use pace and pause and the particular music of the chant to move people toward decisions they had not quite decided to make yet. One afternoon in the autumn of her first year of working with him, sitting in his kitchen over the coffee he made badly, but reliably, he told her about Margaret. His wife had died 4 years before the stroke. They had been married for 41 years, and for 35 of those years she had been, as Earl put it, the half of the operation that the customers never saw, and without which the half they did see would have been considerably less impressive. Before every major auction, Margaret Maddox would move through the crowd in the hour before the sale started, quiet and unhurried the way water moves, talking to people, listening more than talking, picking up the texture of the room. She knew by the time Earl stepped up to the podium which buyers were serious and which were posturing, which ones had come with a specific thing in mind, and which ones were open to being moved, which lots would generate genuine competition, and which ones needed to be handled carefully to extract their full value. She would signal him small gestures they had developed over years, a particular way of tilting her head, a specific arrangement of her hands. He would read the signals and adjust. The best auction I ever recalled, Earl told her, was the Harrington Estate in 1961. 42 lots, full farm equipment, prime land. We exceeded the reserve on every single lot. People talked about those numbers for a decade afterward. He paused, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Margaret worked that room for 90 minutes before I stepped up to the podium. I had the microphone. She had the information. He looked at Cassie with something careful and considered in his expression. I have been watching you read a room for 8 months now. You do what Margaret did. Not yet as well. But the capacity is there, and it's real, and it is not something that can be taught. Either you can do it or you can't, and you can. He picked up his coffee. That is why I agreed to work with you, he said. Not out of sympathy for your situation, though your situation is genuinely unfair, because you have the thing that matters most, and it would be a waste to let Walter Greer bury it. Cassie worked. She drove long distances to call small auctions in towns and counties outside Walter's reach, places where his name didn't carry weight, where she was simply the auctioneer who had come to run the sale, and people would judge her by what they saw. She took jobs that paid barely enough to cover the gas money and her own time, because every auction she called was practice, and every satisfied client was a reference, and every reference was a brick in a wall she was building against the day when Walter Greer's opinion would matter less than her track record. She was not always good. There were sales that went poorly, rooms she misjudged, sequences she got wrong, moments when the rhythm broke down under pressure, and she had to find it again in front of a crowd that was watching her recover. She learned from every one of them. Earl, when she described them on Thursday mornings, would pull apart what had happened with the precise and unsentimental attention of a mechanic diagnosing an engine, identifying exactly where the failure had occurred and what had caused it and what she needed to do differently. He never told her she was doing fine when she wasn't. She respected him enormously for that. By 1978, she was calling auctions regularly in 4 counties. She had a small but growing list of clients who requested her specifically, who had seen her work, and had found to their own mild surprise that the woman auctioneer they'd heard about was not only competent, but in certain respects better than the men they'd used before, quicker to read the room, more careful about sequencing, better at sustaining energy in a crowd through the long middle stretch of a sale when attention naturally dips and prices tend to soften. Walter Greer's network still operated. There were still auction houses in Madison County that wouldn't take her calls, still large landowners who had heard his version of her and had never seen the reality to contradict it. But the geography of his influence had edges, and outside those edges, Cassie Hartwell was building something real. In September of 1978, Earl Maddox called his last auction. It was the Henderson Estate, 400 acres of good farmland with a full equipment line, the kind of sale that in those years represented real money and real stakes. Earl had been approached months earlier and had accepted because it was the kind of work that had defined his career, and he was not ready to let that go without one more demonstration of what he could do. He was not well. Cassie knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them spent much time discussing it because there was nothing useful to be said, and Earl was not a man who found comfort in discussion. He was thinner than he had been, He moved more carefully. But when he stepped up to that podium in front of 400 people on a cool September morning and began to chant, the voice that came out of him was not diminished. It was the voice of 50 years of craft, of 10,000 rooms read and 10,000 crowds worked, and it filled that September air with a kind of authority that made people go still and listen without knowing quite why. He called 4 hours of bidding without a significant break. The numbers were extraordinary. At the end, standing at the podium for the last time in his professional life, Earl Maddox did something that people who were there would discuss for years afterward. He made an announcement. He said that he was retiring. He said that his health required it and that he had come to peace with that requirement. He said that he was not, however, closing his business. He said that Maddox Auction Services would continue and that it would be run by Cassie Hartwell. The crowd reacted the way crowds react to unexpected information. A murmur, a shifting, the sound of 300 people updating their understanding of a situation in real time. Everyone in that field knew Cassie's name. Most of them knew her story, the talent show, Walter Greer, the certificate from Kansas City. Many of them had heard Walter's version of her capabilities carefully circulated through the county's networks over 3 years. Some of them had seen her work. Earl waited for the murmur to settle. Then he said, "I am asking one thing of all of you. Judge her by her results, not by your assumptions, not by what you've heard from people who have never watched her work. Come to one of her auctions. Watch what she does. Look at the numbers. And then decide." He stepped back from the podium. That was the last time Earl Maddox appeared in public. He died in January of 1979 on a gray Thursday morning when the temperature was below zero and the fields were buried under a foot of snow. Cassie was with him. She had been coming to his house every Thursday for 3 years, and she was there on the last Thursday, sitting in the chair across from his armchair, the way she had sat across from him hundreds of times. His last words to her, delivered in the careful way of someone who has decided exactly what needs to be said and is making sure it lands correctly, were these: "Don't let them make you prove you're as good as a man." He paused, breathing carefully. "Prove you're the best auctioneer in Nebraska. Full stop. And when Walter Greer's bill comes due, and it will, you be ready." She drove home in the snow and she sat in the kitchen for a long, hard time, and she did not cry. Not then, not in any way that she showed to anyone. The grief was real and large, and she put it somewhere it would keep and turned her attention to the work. Because the work was what Earl had given her, and honoring it was the only form of tribute that would have meant anything to him. The years between 1979 and 1981 were years of consolidation. Cassie absorbed Maddox Auction's existing client list, most of whom had seen Earl's announcement and were willing to give her a genuine chance, and she added to it steadily, one auction at a time, one satisfied client at a time, building the kind of reputation that is built only one way: by doing the work better than anyone else consistently, without shortcuts, for long enough that the reputation becomes its own argument. Walter Greer did not disappear. His network still functioned. There were still doors closed to her in Madison County that opened easily to men with lesser credentials, and she knew it, and she worked around it, and she kept building. By 1980, Cassie Hartwell was the busiest auctioneer in the region. Not because anyone felt sorry for her. That sympathy had burned off long ago, replaced by something more durable, which was the respect of people who had watched her work and decided that what they had seen was worth coming back for. She had clients in 6 counties. She had a waiting list. She had turned down more work than many auctioneers ever received because she could only be in one place at a time, and there were only so many hours in a week, and she refused to do work badly simply because doing it was possible. She was 23 years old, and in the autumn of 1981, the agricultural world that had formed the backdrop of her entire life began to come apart. The boom years of the 1970s had convinced a great many farmers and landowners across the Great Plains that the trajectory they were on would continue, that land values would keep rising, that commodity prices would hold, that the debt they were taking on to expand their operations was a reasonable bet against a future that seemed certain to reward it. Interest rates had been manageable. Markets had been strong. The optimism was not irrational given what the preceding decade had looked like. Then the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to combat inflation, and raised them again, and kept raising them until the rates reached levels that made the math of farming simply impossible for anyone who had borrowed heavily during the good years. Land that had been valued at $2,000 an acre was suddenly worth a fraction of that. Commodity prices fell through the floor. Farmers who owed more than their assets were worth had no mechanism to survive, no path that led anywhere except the courthouse and the auction yard. The foreclosures began slowly, then accelerated. By late 1981, they were happening across Madison County and every county around it with a regularity that felt to people who had lived in these communities their whole lives like something unnatural, like weather that had forgotten the rules. Walter Greer had been among the most aggressive borrowers during the boom years. He had expanded his operation with the certainty of a man who had never been significantly wrong about anything, purchasing additional acreage, upgrading his equipment line, investing in grain storage infrastructure that had seemed like foresight when grain prices were high and looked now like something else entirely. He had financed through a combination of his own bank's credit lines and larger institutional lenders in Omaha at terms that had seemed favorable in 1976 and were crushing in 1981. By early 1982, Walter Greer owed more than $2 million to various creditors. His assets at current market valuations covered perhaps half of that. He did what powerful people do when the ground shifts under them. He called in his own favors, pressured lenders to extend terms, threatened and negotiated, and worked every connection he had built over 60 years of being the most important man in Madison County. None of it was enough. In March of 1982, the Federal Land Bank in Omaha filed foreclosure proceedings against Walter Greer's operation. The hearing was not long. The judge ordered full liquidation of assets to satisfy outstanding debt obligations. Everything, the acreage, the equipment, the grain storage, the livestock, all of it would be sold at public auction. Someone had to call that auction. The Federal Land Bank's representative in Omaha, a man named Harlan Whitfield, contacted two auctioneers before he contacted Cassie. The first declined without explanation. The second, Whitfield learned afterward, had received a phone call from Walter Greer the evening after being contacted, a call that was polite and indirect and conveyed with perfect clarity that accepting this particular job would have consequences for other business relationships in the county. Harlan Whitfield called Cassie Hartwell on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He explained the situation. He told her about the two previous contacts and what had happened. He told her that his research indicated she had the strongest track record in the region for maximizing auction sale prices on farm estate liquidations, which was what the bank's creditors required, and that this was his primary criterion. And then he said, frankly, Miss Hartwell, given your history with Mr. Greer, we thought you might be interested. She was quiet for a moment. 8 years. 8 years since the Madison County Fair and the yellow dress and the sound of 300 people laughing. 8 years since she had stood at that microphone and told Walter Greer that someday she would sell something of his. She said, I want to be clear about something before I accept. He said, please. I am going to run a fair auction, she said. I am not going to sandbag Walter Greer. I am not going to allow personal history to affect my professionalism. Every item will receive the best price the market will bear. That is my job, and I will do it correctly regardless of who owns the items. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Harlan Whitfield said, Miss Hartwell, that is exactly what I hoped you would say. The auction was scheduled for the 15th of May. Cassie hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table in the same kitchen where her father had placed a folded piece of paper in front of her 8 years ago and changed the direction of everything. She sat there for a long time, not planning, not strategizing, just sitting with the weight of the thing, with the particular quality of a moment that you have been moving toward for so long that its arrival feels both inevitable and entirely unreal. Then she got up and went to her desk and began preparing. She had 2 weeks. She intended to use every hour of them. Cassie Hartwell woke up at 4 in the morning on the 15th of May, 1982, in the same bedroom where she had sat in silence for 3 days after the Madison County Fair, and decided that she was not going to stop. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the quality of the silence, the particular pre-dawn quiet of the Nebraska plains that is not really silence at all, but a low continuous presence wind in the fields, the distant sound of something moving in the dark, the world going about its business before the light arrives to make it visible. Then she got up. She showered and dressed carefully. She put on the clothes she had laid out the night before: dark slacks, a white button-down shirt, the good jacket she had bought 2 years ago, when she started getting the kinds of jobs that required a good jacket. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long moment. She was 24 years old. She had called auctions in 6 counties. She had built a business from a certificate in $400 of her father's money and 3 years of Thursday mornings in an old man's living room and more miles driven on bad roads to small jobs in distant towns than she had ever bothered to count. She had done it against resistance that most people in her position would have found decisive. She had done it because Earl Maddox had told her to prove she was the best, and because her father had told her to stand there until they listened, and because she had discovered at 17 years old that there was one thing in the world she could do better than almost anyone, and she was not willing to let Walter Greer take it from her. She looked at her reflection and she began to chant quietly, barely above a whisper, the words flowing in the smooth, unbroken rhythm that had been her miracle since she was a girl in a barn. The words came easily. They always did when the rhythm was right. She had been building this rhythm for 11 years, and it was deep in her now past thought, past effort, past anything that pressure or exhaustion or the particular weight of what today meant could easily disturb. Earl had told her that was the point, that the day would come when everything depended on her voice, when she would be tired and emotional, and the whole world would be watching, and on that day, the rhythm had to be so far down in her bones that nothing could shake it loose. She turned off the bathroom light and went to the kitchen and made coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the dark over the fields begin to shift toward gray. Then she drove to the Greer property. She arrived before 5:30. The auction was not scheduled to begin until 10, but she wanted to walk every inch of the grounds before anyone else arrived to see it all in the quiet of the early morning, to let the scale of it settle into her understanding without the distraction of people and noise and the particular kind of pressure that 300 bodies in a field generate simply by being present. The Greer operation was enormous in the way that only becomes fully apparent on foot. 2,200 acres of prime farmland stretched to the horizon in every direction from the main complex flat and dark and still carrying the faint smell of last fall's harvest. The barn complex was massive four connected structures that together covered more ground than most of the farms Cassie had grown up around. The equipment lined up in the north field represented the accumulated investment of decades combines and tractors and tillage equipment and trucks, each one cataloged in her notes with its year and condition and the reserve figure the bank had established. The farmhouse itself sat at the center of everything, a large two-story structure that was not quite a mansion, but was considerably more than a farmhouse in the ordinary sense, built by Walter's father in the 1930s and added to and improved over the following 50 years until it had taken on the settled permanence of something that was always supposed to be there. Cassie walked through the equipment lots as the sky went from gray to pale gold, consulting her notes, adjusting her sequence, thinking about the morning's crowd. She had been tracking buyer interest for 2 weeks, making calls, taking the temperature of who was coming and what they were looking for, building the picture of the room she would face at 10 o'clock. The picture was good. The bank's numbers were attainable. The reserves were realistic given current market conditions. If she did her job correctly, and she intended to do her job correctly, the creditors would be satisfied and there would be something left over for Walter. Not much, but something. She was making a note about the sequence of the equipment lots when she heard a truck pull into the driveway. She recognized the truck. She had seen it in the county her entire life, a black 3/4 ton that Walter Greer's had owned for 10 years, maintained with the fastidious attention he gave to everything that belonged to him, or had belonged to him. After today, the truck would belong to whoever bid highest on lot 47. Walter got out alone. The years had worked on him in ways that were visible even across the distance of the gravel drive. He was thinner than she remembered the broad solidity of the man she had watched stand up in the county fair tent and fill a room with his certainty reduced to something leaner and less anchored. He moved carefully, not with the carefulness of age exactly, but with the deliberate quality of someone who is managing something, carrying a weight that does not show, but changes the way a person moves through space. He walked toward her across the gravel. She waited. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a moment without speaking. In the early morning light, his face was older than she had expected, the lines deeper, but the eyes carrying something that had not been in them at the county fair. Something that might have been fatigue it might have been a more complicated form of knowledge. So he said, "It's you." His voice was quieter than she remembered. The booming authority was still there underneath it, the trained projection of a man who had commanded rooms for 60 years, but it was not deployed now. He was not performing. He was just talking. Cassie looked at him steadily. "Mr. Greer," she said. He looked out at the equipment lined up in the north field. His equipment, the machines he had bought and maintained and used for decades that bore in their wear patterns and their modifications, the specific history of his specific operation, the record of all the decisions he had made about how to farm this particular land. He looked at them for a long moment. "I never thought it would be you," he said. "Not like this." She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it in the 2 weeks of preparation, had turned it over, and examined it from different angles, had considered what she might say if the opportunity arose. She had decided to say exactly what was true because anything else would be a kind of performance, and this moment did not call for a performance. "I'm going to run a fair auction, Mr. Greer," she said. "Every item on this lot gets the best price the market will bear. That is my job, and I intend to do it properly, regardless of any other consideration." He looked at her, then a direct look that went past the surface of things. "I know you will," he said. He said it as though the knowledge was not comfortable, but was genuine. He looked back at the equipment. "I made a lot of calls when you were starting out, closed a lot of doors." She said nothing. "I told myself I was being realistic," he said. "Told myself I was explaining how things worked." He paused. "I was protecting something. I convinced myself it was the integrity of the business." He paused again, longer this time. "That was not entirely what it was." She waited. He looked at her again, and for a moment the thing in his eyes was very clear. The thing underneath the fatigue and the loss. Something that looked like a man who has had a great deal of time recently to examine his own history and has not found everything he looked for. Then he nodded once, a small motion, and turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. She watched him go, and then she turned back to her notes, and she kept preparing. By 9:30, the cars and trucks were coming in off the county road in a steady stream. By 10 o'clock, more than 300 people had gathered in and around the equipment lots, the barn complex, the field where the smaller items were arranged in numbered rows. It was a large crowd, larger than most estate sales, Drew, because this was not an ordinary estate sale. This was Walter Greer's operation, the largest in Madison County, and the people who came knew that. Some of them had come because they were serious buyers. Some had come because they had dealt with Walter for decades and felt they owed him the witness of their presence. And some, Cassie knew, had come because they wanted to see what she would do with the microphone, whether the woman who had been calling auctions in the outlying counties for 8 years could hold a room of this size on a stage of this significance. She let them wonder for the 4 minutes between when she stepped up to the podium and when she began. She used those 4 minutes to look at the crowd, not to perform looking, not to signal anything to anyone, but to actually look, to do what Margaret Maddox had done in the hour before Earl stepped up, reading the room, feeling the temperature of it, locating the serious buyers, and mapping the energy. She found what she was looking for. The room was tense with attention. It was the kind of crowd that was ready to be moved, that had come already leaning forward, and that was what she needed. She adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "welcome to the Greer Estate Auction. We have a full day of work ahead of us. Let's begin." And then the rhythm took over. It is difficult to describe what Cassie Hartwell did over the following 6 hours to someone who has not stood in a crowd when a great auctioneer is working, because the experience of it is not primarily intellectual. It operates on something older than thought. The chant she had been building since she was a girl in a barn, that rolling rhythmic flood of syllables and numbers and invitation, filled the May morning air and did what great auctioneering does when it is working correctly. It created a shared reality, a contained world in which the only thing that mattered was the lot in front of the crowd and the number the auctioneer was holding and the question of whether the next bid would come. She opened with the large equipment because the large equipment was where the serious buyers were positioned and where the money was and where the energy would be highest in the first hour. A 1979 John Deere combine that she had estimated at $65,000 went to a farmer from Antelope County after a contest that lasted 4 minutes and ended at $72,000. The crowd felt that. She felt the crowd feel it, the shift in the room when a number exceeds expectation, the collective recalibration of what is possible today. She built on it. Lot by lot, hour by hour, she worked through the catalog she had assembled over 2 weeks of preparation. She read the room the way Earl had taught her, adjusting her pace when attention was flagging, slowing down to let tension build when two serious bidders were pushing each other, finding the moment in each lot when the price had reached what the room would bear, and closing it there cleanly, without leaving money behind and without pushing past the point where the buyer's confidence would have broken. Walter Greer and his wife sat in chairs in the front row through all of it. She was aware of them the way you are aware of something that is important without looking at it directly. She did not direct her performance toward them. She did not perform away from them. She did what she had promised to do, which was her job executed as well as she was capable of executing it for the creditors and the buyers and the market and the craft itself, which does not care about personal history and cannot be done correctly if you let personal history into it. At 2 in the afternoon, 6 hours after she had begun, she closed the final lot. The total was announced by Harlan Whitfield 20 minutes later, after the bank's representatives had run the numbers twice to confirm them. The total exceeded the combined outstanding debt by enough that there would be a remainder, a modest amount that would go to Walter Greer after all obligations were satisfied. Cassie stepped away from the podium. Her voice was raw in the way it always was after a full day of calling a productive rawness, the particular fatigue of a tool that has been used correctly and hard. Her jacket was damp. Her feet inside the good shoes she had worn because the day called for them ached in the way that 6 hours of standing on gravel produces. People came to shake her hand. Buyers she had worked before, farmers from the outlying counties, Harlan Whitfield, who held her hand in both of his and said in a voice that was clearly more than professional courtesy, "That was one of the finest auction calls I have ever personally witnessed." Men who had not known what to expect, who had come with Walter's version of her capabilities somewhere in the back of their minds, and were now revising that version in real time, came to tell her what they had seen. She thanked each of them. She meant it. She was also watching from the corner of her attention the front of the crowd. Walter Greer was standing up. He was walking toward her, and his wife was beside him, a small woman with gray hair who had been sitting in that front row chair all day with an expression of composed devastation, the face of someone who is keeping herself together through sheer force of the discipline that decades of a certain kind of life instill. As Walter walked through the crowd, people made way for him the way they always had, not from fear now, but from something older than that, the habit of deference to a man who had been the largest presence in this county for as long as most of them could remember. The crowd around Cassie quieted and opened. Walter stopped in front of her. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm. The hand of a man who had worked this land for 60 years, who had built something large on it, who had lost it in the way that the 1980s farm crisis took everything from the people it chose without asking whether they deserved it. "That was the finest auction I have ever seen," he said. His voice was quiet and it was entirely genuine, the kind of genuine that has no performance in it, because there is nothing left to perform for. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer." He did not release her hand immediately. He held it for a moment, and she let him because she could see that he had something else to say, and she was willing to wait for it. That morning at the county fair, he said, 8 years ago. She waited. He looked at her directly the way he had looked at her across the gravel in the early morning light, past the surface of things, with the clear eyes of a man who has been alone with himself long enough to stop arguing about what he sees. "I stood up in front of 300 people, and I told them you were a joke." He said it plainly without flinching from it. "I told them that because I was certain I was right, and because I had never been significantly wrong about anything that mattered, and because the idea of being wrong in that particular way about a girl with a stutter, wanting to stand where I'd stood my whole life, was not something I was capable of taking seriously." He paused. His wife put her hand on his arm. "I have thought about that morning more than you know," he said, "more than I would have predicted, and I have had a great deal of time for thinking recently." He looked at her steadily. "I did not know what I was watching." He stopped. "I thought I was watching something ridiculous. I did not know I was watching the bravest person I would ever meet in my life." The words landed in the quiet of the afternoon in the space the crowd had made around them, and for a moment nothing else existed. Cassie looked at this man who had spent 8 years trying to make sure she failed, who had used his money and his relationships and the full weight of his position to close every door he could reach, and she looked at him as he actually was in this moment, old and diminished, and standing in the field of everything he had lost, and she said what she had decided she would say if this moment ever came. I know what it feels like to have people tell you who you are before you've had the chance to show them, she said. I would not wish that on anyone. Walter Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you are a better person than I was, than I am. She did not argue with him. She also did not agree. It was not she had decided a conversation that needed to go in either direction. What had happened was what had happened. What she had built was what she had built. The morning at the county fair in the 3 years of Earl Maddox's Thursday mornings and the 100 small auctions in distant counties and the 6 hours of chanting in the May air above this field had all been part of the same continuous thing, and she had no interest in reducing it to a verdict about who was better or worse. I hope Arizona is good to you, she said. I mean that. Walter Greer looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded the same small motion as the early morning, and he and his wife turned and walked toward the black truck that would carry them out of Madison County for the last time. Cassie watched them go. She did not see him again. Now let me tell you what came after, because a story that ends with one auction is not really the whole story. Cassie Hartwell went on to call more than 4,000 auctions over a career that spanned 3 decades. Farm liquidations and estate sales and livestock auctions and charity events and the occasional unusual assignment that came her way because her reputation had grown past the borders of Nebraska and spread into the broader world of the profession she had chosen at 17 in a yellow cotton dress in a county fair tent. She was named Nebraska Auctioneer of the Year 3 times. She was the first woman to receive that award. She was not the last. She never stopped working harder than the people around her. That was not a strategy she had deployed tactically and then relaxed when the need for it passed. It was simply who she was, the person that the barn and the boarding house in Kansas City and the Thursday mornings with Earl Maddox and the 100 long drives to small auctions had made her, and it did not change when the pressure eased because it was not pressure that had created it. In the years after the Greer auction, she established a set of free annual workshops for children and young adults with speech impediments. The workshops were not what she might have predicted herself designing, not instruction in auctioneering. Specifically, though, some of the participants were interested in that, but instruction in the broader principles she had discovered at 13 years old in her father's barn, that the rhythm carries you where ordinary speech cannot go, that there are ways around the walls that build themselves in your throat, that the obstacle is not the end of the thing, but sometimes the beginning of a deeper understanding of it. Dozens of the young people who came through those workshops went on to careers in broadcasting, public speaking, law teaching, and yes, some of them went on to auctioneering, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had drawn Cassie to the wooden bleachers of a county auction yard when she was 6 years old. She established a scholarship in Earl Maddox's name because what Earl had given her could not be returned to him and therefore had to be passed forward. The Earl Maddox Scholarship sent more than 200 young people to auction school over the years, students who could not otherwise have managed the tuition and the lost wages of 3 weeks away from their lives. 1/3 of them were women. That was not an accident. Eldon Hartwell lived to see his daughter receive the first of her Auctioneer of the Year awards. He sat in the 3rd row at the ceremony, which delighted Cassie because he would never have chosen the 3rd row for any reason except that it was where he had sat at the Madison County Fair, and she understood that he remembered the way. She remembered the way all of it was still present in both of them, the way important things are always present, not as wounds exactly, but as permanent landmarks in the interior geography of a life. He did not say much at the dinner afterward. He was still that kind of man. But when they were driving home on the flat roads through the dark Nebraska fields, he put his hand briefly on her arm and said, I knew you would. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Willa Hartwell had a copy of the award framed and hung it in the kitchen next to the window where Cassie had stood drinking coffee in the dark on the morning of the Greer auction. Every August, Cassie went back to the Madison County Fair. Not to compete, not to make any statement or revisit any moment or place a flag on any territory. She went to watch the youth talent competition, to sit in the crowd and look at the faces of the young people who walked up to that microphone with something they wanted to say to the world, and to pay attention to the ones who struggled, who froze, who faced the particular exposure of a public moment of failure and had to decide in real time what kind of person they were going to be about it. When she found one, she waited until after the competition, and she found them backstage or in the parking lot or at the lemonade stand outside the tent, and she introduced herself. She always did it the same way. She would say, and the words would catch the way they had always caught, the stutter still present, after all these decades, still the same unwanted companion it had always been. And she would say, My name is Cassie Hartwell." She would pause, and she would say, "I became the best auctioneer in Nebraska." The young person would almost always look at her then with an expression that was part confusion and part something else, something that was beginning to understand that the information being offered was not casual, that it had been carried a long distance and was being delivered specifically for one of them. And Cassie would say quietly, "Give me a microphone. I'll show you what I can do." She is 84 years old now. She still stutters in ordinary conversation, still feels the wall come up, sometimes in the middle of sentences, in the middle of thoughts. The old familiar collision between intention and production that she has been managing her entire life. It has not gone away. She never expected it to go away. She made peace with it, which is different, and she made it on her own terms, which is the only way peace with something like that can actually hold. She still has the rhythm. If you put a microphone in front of Cassie Hartwell, if you give her a podium and a crowd and a catalog of lots and the particular electricity of a room full of people who are about to make decisions with real money and real consequences, something happens. The stutter disappears. The wall comes down. The words come in that unbroken rolling stream that she first found at 13 years old in a barn in Madison County, Nebraska. And it is exactly as fluid and controlled and precise as it was when she was 24 years old and calling the Greer estate in the May morning air. Not everyone gets to discover what they were made for. Cassie Hartwell was 17 years old and standing at a microphone in front of 300 laughing people when she found out what she was made for. She was not made for easy acceptance or smooth paths or the comfortable agreement of the people around her. She was made for exactly the things she had been told she could not do, which is how it usually goes with the things that matter most. What Walter Greer did not understand sitting in his front row chair at the Madison County Fair in 1974 and laughing at a girl in a yellow dress who couldn't say her own name without stuttering was that the laughter was not the end of something. It was the beginning. It was the pressure that would form the thing he was mocking into something he could not have imagined from where he was sitting. He came to understand it eventually. That is the thing about the bill coming due. It has a way of clarifying everything. And Cassie Hartwell, who had been standing at a microphone waiting for 300 people to stop laughing at her before she could say what she came to say, had all the time in the world. She had learned at 17 how to wait. She had learned that the rhythm, once you find it, does not leave you. She had learned that the people who get laughed at, who are told no and turned away and have every door closed against them by men who are certain they understand the shape of the world, those are precisely the people who change it. All they need is a microphone and someone in their corner and enough time. The rest takes care of itself.